This is Frame by Frame from New York, and I'm Isabel Siderni. As movie-going audiences choose more often to view their entertainment on the smaller screens of home theaters, tablets, and phones, movies like Gemini Man, directed by Ang Lee and shot in 4K resolution at 120 frames per second for 3D projection, are intentionally built to create a hyper-real, immersive experience that will incentivize audiences to experience films on a big screen in a large theater with a crowd and participate in vital communal catharsis. For the filmmakers, the choice to work in this format was on almost every level a technological experiment.
You had to invent everything.
Yeah, everything. All the tools that you are relying on for post-production, the majority of them, they don't work. It's something as simple as timecode. Not simple, as fundamental as timecode for a workflow doesn't exist at 120.
For the post-production team especially, the format became a valuable testing ground for every aspect of media exchange along the pipeline. I sat down with Gemini Man's picture editor, Tim Squyres, 3D Digital Intermediate Supervisor, Derek Schweickart, First Assistant Editor, Andrew Leven, and Associate Producer and Post-Production Supervisor, Jennifer Lane, to talk about why this pioneering format required that they construct their own mobile lab to process the media, and how they believe the format ultimately supports better storytelling. Frame by Frame is presented by Post New York Alliance because it's how you finish that counts. This episode marks the beginning of a new series exploring innovations in post-production and the vanguard film professionals in New York that are leading the way. We started off answering the question, why choose the high frame rate of 120 frames per second? Especially when some filmmakers have argued that 120 frames per second is a very valuable tool for specific applications, but not necessarily advantageous to use as a constant format.
Our decision to shoot at 120 goes back a couple of films. On Life of Pi, there's a certain amount of strobing and a certain amount of motion blur that is inherent in 24, which is fine, but in 3D, the strobing is more noticeable and more irritating. And so what DPs usually do to compensate for that is open up the shutter angle. Instead of shooting with a 180 shutter angle, they shoot with a 280 shutter angle. And so you get more motion blur. And in Life of Pi, there's some scenes where he's on a raft that's bobbing up and down in the ocean, and we were starting to lose his performance in the motion blur. And when Ang was thinking about the next movie that he wanted to do, it was a boxing movie, or it was going to be a boxing movie. We wound up not doing that movie. But thinking about the way that boxers move in a ring, you'd never be able to see what happens. If, whenever boxers move like they really move, it's all just lost in motion blur. And so, there's no way to beat the strobing motion blur thing at 24. But if you go higher, you can get less motion blur and open up the shutter angle and get less strobing as well. So we shot a bunch of tests. And what we discovered is, at 24, when a boxer is coming in toward the camera, is just this kind of exciting blur. At 60, you can see what he's thinking. You can see his emotion as he's coming in. So we thought, okay, that solves the problem. And so, we decided to go to higher frame rates. But if you shoot at 60, you still have a delivery requirement of 24. And you can't make a 24 from a 60 without going through some complicated steps that are expensive and have questionable results. So the right way to do it is to shoot at 120. And that way, that's 60 times 2 or 24 times 5. And that way you can create both of those easily. And at the time, we were not at all thinking of 120 as a release format. We were thinking of it as a capture format. So we were just shooting 120 so that we could create the other frame rates. But we had the ability to project that in our screening room. And so we screened the 120 and thought that was pretty cool. So, on Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, the film that he did after Life of Pi, we did manage to set up a few theaters, 3 in China and 2 in the United States briefly, that showed 120 4K 3D, which is how we actually shot it. But those are the only theaters where we actually projected the frames that we shot. Everywhere else, we used our 120 frames to create the 24 and 60 frames that we actually projected. Mm-hmm. In China, the theaters that showed that format were sold out for weeks. The response in those 3 theaters, one in Beijing, one in Shanghai, and one in Taipei, those theaters did tremendous business. In the United States, it was barely released in that format.
Was it obvious to you that the format, when it was released in its kind of full potency, had a direct relationship with the audience? Or do you think that the culture was kind of ready for it and seasoned for it in a different way than the American audience is seasoned for like these higher frame rates?
The Chinese audiences love 3D. They're much more open to other formats and perhaps a little less set in their ways than American audiences. But it wasn't really released in that format or any 3D format really in the United States for complicated reasons. But it's, the sections, we did show some sections of the movie, big chunks of the movie at some technical conferences, and the response was really overwhelming. It's a very, very powerful, visceral experience, much more so than you're used to in a movie theater.
I asked Tim Squyres to tell us a little bit more about the history of frame rates in filmmaking, why frame rate might be a tool that can make it easier for an audience to invest emotionally, and why and when the standard was set at 24 frames per second.
Back in the silent film days, the speed at which you showed film was the speed at which the cameraman cranked it, which was usually between 16 and 19 frames a second. When sound came in, when they started putting an optical soundtrack on the side of the film, first of all, it had to be motorized, so it had to be standardized because it had to run at a constant speed or it would warble. And they also discovered that in order to get enough sound fidelity, 18 wasn't fast enough. You have to get more information past the sound reader than that. And so 24 was the slowest they could go and have decent sound. So that's why we do 24. There's no other reason. It's not like they sat in a lab and tested all kinds of different formats. I've heard that Thomas Edison preferred 72. But 24, given what audiences were used to, in silent film days, they weren't used to moving pictures at all. So it's not like, 24 was a step up. And that's what we've been watching ever since. And everybody's used to it, and people have done great work in it. But there's no inherent reason why that's the way film should look.
I'd be curious to know if there's a lot of pushback at the time, people saying, you can't put sound on a movie. That doesn't make any sense. And then you can't put color on a movie.
Oh, yeah.
I believe there was. I don't have any good references.
Well, when
for
color came in, definitely people thought, well, it's okay for this movie, for The Wizard of Oz, sure, but you don't want to do it for every movie.
Right.
And when HD came in for television, a lot of people didn't like it. They didn't like it. It was too much. But then they saw it with sports. And sports is fantastic in HD. And everybody got used to it there, and then actually got used to it for dramatic material. And now nobody wants to watch standard def.
Yeah, I think what's interesting in the history of digital over the last, 25 years or so since HD Cam started to become a thing was, at first it didn't have the ability to compete with film because of the dynamic range, right? It looked, the highlights would clip, it always looked different. And then vendors like Arri were kind of late to the game, but they really took a long time to emulate this filmic look. But I think that what's interesting about the frame rate is it's sort of delivering on the potential of digital in a way, because, right, even if you wanted to do high frame rate on film because you're interested, and I know Doug Trumbull did in ShowScan years ago, it would just be cost prohibitive now. But because of digital, you can. Not to say it doesn't cost more to have more data, as we know on Gemini Man, but still, there's no real limitation to that. So I think it's an open playground for people to start to see what can be achieved in terms of storytelling with that extra bit of information of your character in a moment that's not blurred out. What are you seeing? How does that affect the performance? How does it affect the pacing? How does it affect everything?
And how does it affect what I feel when I watch it?
One of the real surprises we had from the tests that we shot was, we thought a big difference would be when there's a lot of fast motion during action. But Ang also shot an actor just sitting in a chair reading a monologue, and that looked drastically different. You notice the difference right away, and you can see all kinds of differences, all kinds of nuances in the performance that you're not used to seeing You would think it would only mattered in action, but it's a different look for the entire film, and things come out in the performance that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah, it's also, I think, a different relationship that the audience has with the materials. And so when we were working on Building Land, we tried testing different frame rates to intercut, going between 24 and 60 and 120 for various reasons. This scene was a less stressed out scene, so we're going to try 24. This is more action, we're going to try 120. And it was so disruptive and jarring to the experience of watching it.
If you started at 24, it would look normal, and then you go up to 60, and wow, that looks different, and it takes you out. And then you go back to 24, and 24 doesn't look normal anymore. It looks terrible because your eyes got used to 60. And that's one thing that really struck us in doing this is when we watch things at 24, material that we're used to at 60, and we watch it at 24, it looks horrible because we're used to it looking better. And every time you switch back, you just go, I can't believe every movie I've ever looked at looks like this because this looks awful.
I mean, in terms of a brief history of high frame rate, just in my understanding of it, there hasn't been very many. I mean, Peter Jackson did his The Hobbit. That was 48 shot with a 180-degree shutter. So it was essentially the same as 24, faster, and has all the inherent problems of 24, which is judder. You just have it kind of faster, if that makes sense. There's no control really over the motion blur in post the way that we would have by acquiring 120. Other than that, I mean, you know, there's higher frame rate stuff on television, which is where whenever we present feature film at a higher frame rate, there's that immediate comparison to the video. It looks like video, it looks like, that soap opera effect. I think that's mostly a cultural, just a frame of reference thing. And it looks different. It looks kind of like this thing I have a memory of, therefore that's what I'm going to call it, right? And other than that, no one has really made a full-length feature film out of a rate higher than 24, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and it really does look different. Cinema, digital cameras, since they've been introduced, have been trying to mimic the film look, and this does not look like film. It looks like something different. And so when people are used to seeing something, then you show them something different, it's going to look weird to some people. We knew that going in.
It takes a little bit of time to get used to.
Yeah.
One thing that we were interested in is, how do you bring somebody into the high frame rate? Do you throw them right in? Can you ease them in to it? Designing stories where you're going into two completely different worlds that then have a different frame rate might be more effective than what we tried because, like if you had a sequence that really went from color to black and white, or even Wizard of Oz is a perfect example. If you had an opening that was one world and black and white 24 and then another world that's color 120, would that be more acceptable? Potentially,
Yeah,
So
a film like Ready Player One or something, where you're going back and forth between the real world and the computer world would be ideally suited for this. But you would still have the issue of after you've been in the 120 for a while, then you go back to 24 of people going, ugh, this movie looks ugly.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and that's
because
where...
it wouldn't look normal anymore. Once your eyes get used to the higher, it's very hard to go back.
So then is it worth having something else in, like a color shift, and then you go back to 60 at that point? Like, how many of those things do you do? I mean, it's, there's a world of possibility in terms of what you can do.
Well, what the powerful moment about making these choices is that you're in new territory. I mean, this is the second film in the history of cinema that's chosen 120 frames per second as a format, and it's improved since the last time you tried.
It vastly improved, I think, from a workflow point of view, for sure. I mean, when we did Building Land, we didn't know what we were doing. We really just...
You had to invent everything.
Yeah, everything. All the tools that you are relying on for post-production, the majority of them, they don't work. It's something as simple as time code. Not simple, as fundamental as time code for a workflow doesn't exist on 120, right? I mean, there's no standard for it. Cameras don't put it onto the media. No edit system will use it. So we had to come up with a lot of solutions for how to keep track of things and how to, do that.
So let's talk about that. So you guys ended up building your own lab, essentially, in order to accommodate the demands of this frame rate.
No lab could accommodate what we needed, so we had to do it all ourselves.
Yeah, and it would have been too much to ask for a facility because it was so demanding, to upgrade all the storage and everything. So it made more sense ultimately to do it do it in-house. Interestingly for me, I mean, I worked on Life of Pi before doing all of this, and I helped build the dailies lab for that. That was just for production, but it was similar in the sense of the requirement of 3D, because Aang wanted to be able to watch dailies in 3D, and that's not something that's available everywhere. And we were shooting at an abandoned airport in Taiwan for a good chunk of it, and then the other part of the movie was filmed on location in India. So, there weren't 3D post houses that you could go to do dailies in any kind of reasonable way. So we put in a 3D cinema projector, and we built a screening room. So, he had an experience of doing that. Ben Gervais, who's not here, who's our technical supervisor, and Dimitri Portelli, our stereographer, we worked on Hugo together for Martin Scorsese, and we did a similar thing there. So when Ben got involved with the high frame rate, we put our heads together and figured out how are we going to build a lab and ship it from, on Billy Lynn, we had to ship it from Atlanta to Morocco and back. And then on this one, we had to ship it from Georgia again to Budapest to New York. We had a unit in Cartagena that we were actually able to manage remotely, which was, I can't believe we pulled that off, because we were uploading the master dailies from some dark fiber spot that they were able to find for us in Colombia. We're talking 20 terabytes a day on a big day. Anywhere from like 12 to 24 terabytes a day was how much we were shooting. And we were able to kind of get at least a consistent enough pipe that 24 hours to download it. We had good speeds and made it work. And you guys weren't too far behind. Yeah.
No, we kept up pretty well.
Yeah. We had extensive pre-production on this film too, which was great, which was something that everybody fought for. I think I started in November of, 2017, and we started shooting in February. So it was about 5 months total. So, I was there before a lot of other people, because we actually had to receive all of the gear. And actually, that whole process started well before. Ben spec'd out, all the equipment. He did the wiring diagrams and sort of came to the project based on the Billy Lynn experiences with a plan. The biggest thing for us was the storage, because we had so much data and we wanted to keep it all online. So, and that was the biggest expense for the overall lab, was 3 petabytes of storage.
It's 5 times a normal size film times 2. 24 to 120 plus 3D. So you have 10 times.
Plus potentially 4K versus 2K, which is then 40 times.
40 times.
So if you're doing a 2D 2K, which most people don't, but if you're doing 2D 2K 24, we're 40 times the amount of
40
data.
times as many pixels for the same amount of screen time.
Which is intense, to manage. But so everything just needed to be addressed with that consideration, and you scale up, and then if the speeds are there, you're kind of doing the job, right? You're rendering a day's worth of dailies, because we were turning around dailies daily. We would show Monday's footage on Tuesday after wrap in 4K, 3D, 120, because we had network connections, we had storage that was fast enough. That was the key thing, and being able to maintain it.
When we were in Budapest, Andrew was in New York setting up our rooms for when I came back from Budapest at the end of the shoot. And he was going to be in a room right outside of where the storage was. And I said, I don't think you want to be in that room, because I'm across the hall and the door's down the hallways, and I can hear it in my room. So you are not going to want to be anywhere near where all that storage is, because it's loud.
It's loud, yeah. There's a lot of air conditioning and power.
Yeah, the reason it wasn't edited at Aang's normal editing space was that we needed a space that could handle these ginormous air conditioners that blasted so loud you couldn't go into the back storage room without wearing noise-canceling earphones.
Yeah, the noise-canceling earphones are really helpful, because it, it's just a tone that kind of burrows in your brain.
Andrew, will you talk about what added steps or kind of what added load that was for you as a workload, considering the format?
Yeah, so like when we did Billy Lynn, we kind of treated things like it was like a normal workflow, right? And editorial kind of showed up a week before shooting started, and we all just kind of acted like everything was going to be fine. And a lot of things went wrong in the very beginning, and it kind of forced editorial to essentially go back to the days where editorial, like we were syncing the dailies to sound and generating a lot of the metadata and things like that. And this time around, I was able to say, look, this is what editorial needs. This is how it's going to round trip. Like once, it leaves you guys and comes to us, then it goes to sound, it goes to the DI, and this is the information that needs to get passed on to those departments. So thankfully we were able to iron that out so that, we didn't have any problems. In terms of dailies, like day one, we got them, and
dailies was smooth. The main thing was time code, right? Because we had a camera master that was 120 frames per second, and the only time code that we could put onto it was 24. Because essentially, we're running all the cameras in high speed mode, that it's designed for doing slow motion, right? But then the best option for cutting, and really the only option for cutting in Avid, was 60. So immediately the question is, well, how do you do that? Do you just drop frames? Okay, so we drop frames. Okay, well, what time code do you use? And how do you conform? And, how do you, and if the cameras are running faster than real time, you can't have time code on your camera that's the same as sound because they're running at two different rates now. So, once you start looking at it, you go, oh, yeah, okay, these are the obvious problems. And then, all right, well, what are the fixes and what are the gotchas that come along with that? And that was why it was good to have one movie under our belt going into this one.
Well, that was the thing. I remember they ran the camera at their 24, running 5 times as fast. And then all of our dailies started at 0. And they calculated, for this clip, 0 equals this time code so that they could get to where they needed to once we got to the DI. But I remember the first time that I spoke to Ben, and he was like, I was like, all right, so like, what's the workflow? Like, how are we going to do this? And he was like, so all your dailies are going to be at 0. And I just turned to him and I was like, what are you talking about? I think I actually said to him, like, straight face, I'm like, that's not going to work. And he was like, that's what you're getting. Because that's what we need it to be in order for this to work.
Coming out of Gemini Man right now, I feel like, we learned so much by having to kind of deconstruct post-production that I think that what we ended up doing was taking the database, like the master database of what we shot, out of Avid, essentially, right? It doesn't mean that it was, like, the Avid database wasn't essential for putting the movie together, but there was information that we didn't have the ability to get into Avid, and we had to utilize a third-party thing, which the benefit to that was actually being able to customize the conform process, tracking the original camera information, time code, everything we could. So from time code to sound to script notes to lens information, 3D notes, just everything that we could gather, we would put into one central database. And then when it would come time to conform, I would read an EDL from editorial, starting with a 0 time code, and we would know exactly how many frames off from the start of that clip their cut was. And that was simple math then to derive the pull lists and how we could put it back together.
I'm just imagining like this lab as like a smoking box.
A lot of boxes. It was when they packed it up to leave Budapest. How many pallets was it? Do you remember?
It was like 130 pallets.
Yeah. It was like a freighter.
It was, yeah.
It was several trucks.
Yeah, 2 full trucks. We got really lucky actually at the end that there was space in the building we were working out of. We were working out of Final Frame, was where we built up the lab. But on that floor, there was a whole side of the floor that was just empty. That basically became our temporary shipping and receiving. And I don't know what we would have done. There's no way to just do it on the sidewalk in New York City. Because space is at a premium. We got lucky with that, I gotta say. Budapest was nice because we built it up in Origo Studios, which is a fully functioning post house, and they had a huge machine room, and they had room for us.
That was a pretty great facility.
It was a great facility.
We screened the assembly as an Avid output. We didn't conform back from the dailies until the first preview. Is that true?
Yeah.
So
the director's cut.
Yeah,
the director's cut.
first director's cut screening
for the studio.
So during the assembly process, I'm just doing the normal Avid thing, and we screened that.
But you were cutting in 3D.
Yes, I was cutting in 3D at 60 DNX 290.
Side by side.
Side by side, yeah.
We should talk about that.
Yeah. So When we were doing Billy Lynn, 60 3D, it's a lot of bandwidth. And the nitrous Avid hardware wouldn't run at 60. So working with Matt Schneider at Postworks, we did a lot of tests. He did a lot of testing to find out, what combination of versions of Media Composer, because Media Composer at that time, only beta versions ran at 60. And we had to use Blackmagic hardware to find a method that would actually work. And when we started, it just barely worked. And so I knew I had to cut in 3D. I had to cut at a higher frame rate because, when you're cutting, you don't want to have to sit and think about, well, at high frame rate, this will look different, so I should cut it differently. You just want to be able to watch what you're actually going to be seeing. So that's why even on Life of Pi, I cut entirely in 3D. So I couldn't compromise on the frame rate, and I couldn't compromise on 3D. So we did compromise a bit on resolution. Cut in HD side by side, which in 3D, that means you take each image and squeeze them horizontally and squeeze them into one frame. So it's HD high, half HD wide. And then it's DNX 290, which is 115 times 2.5. It looks pretty good, but that was the best we could do and have it actually work. Knowing that we could, since we had our own lab, we could ask for the discrete eyes if we needed to, but it turned out we didn't really need to. It's the beauty of having your own lab is anytime you need something different, you just say, hey.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, so on Gemini Man, we built the lab and basically the color pipeline and workflow around the film light tools. So we ran dailies using Baselight, and we used Baselights for making all the media. And we actually used daylight on set for generating the looks, right? So we had an end-to-end BLG workflow, which meant that on set, the DIT, Indy Siney, she was able to work with the DP, Dion Beebe, and they would set looks with secondaries if they wanted to, and all of that would translate into dailies and all the way into visual effects pools and all the way into DI. And they didn't do too many secondaries, but the Baselight grading tools are really great, and there's some of the tools are just not CDL values, because traditionally most people are using like a LUT plus CDL for doing the color pipeline, which is obviously great and adequate. Keeping it in the one language, the one tool set, that really helped. And because it was all one lab and one team running this from end to end, when we got into the visual effects polls, it was very easy to call up that shoot day and look at what the color grade was, and if there are any questions about why this color looks weird, it was very easy to call up that day's dailies. And because we're on the same storage that we've been on, because we've been shipping it around the world, everything is online essentially from start to finish. So that really helped tremendously across the board for pulling this off for the lab, because there were just less handoffs. Everything was centralized, and it sped it all up tremendously.
The other level that I am thinking of too is not only is this a high frame rate experiment, but there's an entire character that's computer generated.
Yeah.
And all of
that too.
Yeah, that too.
Just that little thing that added to the workflow somehow, I'm sure, and had to factor into every aspect of how to tell the story. Can you talk about integrating that and how that was organized to make sure that everybody got what they needed?
Yeah, I mean, the way that the young Will Smith character was photographed during production, in scenes where both Will Smiths appeared together, the young one was played by somebody else who's the right height. But, his performance didn't matter. He was just there for blocking purposes. In scenes where just the young one is there, but the old one is not, Will Smith played the character with a bunch of dots on his face and this capture headgear on. And then for the scenes where the other actor was playing the part, there were two sessions, one halfway through the shoot right when we got to Budapest, and one at the end, where we spent a couple of weeks doing performance capture with Will Smith now playing the young character, and captured his performance, both motion capture for the body and facial capture for his facial performance. And when they recorded those, they also shot him. They had, half a dozen or a dozen cameras scattered around the set, shooting him from all different angles. So for a long time, until we had shots back from Weta, that's what we used. I found the camera that most closely matched what was in the real photography, and went through all the takes and found the performances I liked, just the way you cut any performance, and comped those in little picture-in-picture boxes that tracked with the other actor. So it was, kind of funny looking for a while. We got used to it pretty quickly, but it got kind of hard to show audiences.
Bobblehead Jr.?
Yeah, because you had Will Smith, with dots all over his face, wearing this headgear in a box on top of somebody else's body. And, that's what we did. And that's the way I cut for a long time. And often because his performance in the performance capture was so different from what the actor did originally, I had to go back and kind of recut the scene, because what old Will Smith was playing against was different. So sometimes you had to restructure things a little bit or just change the performances. So I kind of had to cut everything twice.
The junior character was created by Weta in New Zealand, and they were present on set for all of this. And the scenes in which the junior character existed had to be locked on the early side, which is creatively challenging when you work on a studio movie. But they worked in 120, and they worked in the full capture resolution, 120, 4K, 3D. But they sent back QuickTimes in 60 for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, we would often do blocking at 30. Sometimes do early lighting, at 2, just to kind of work out the looks. So they didn't go to 120 until the very end, because it's just a lot of frames to render out, and it wasn't necessary, especially because things that I was cutting to the Avid, I could only work at 60 anyway. Part of the key to making this work, I said you use the 120 frames to make the 60 and the 24. When you shoot at 120, the way we shot was with a 360-degree shutter. So you're recording everything. So that, we'll say to do the 24, you could combine frames 1, 2, 3, and then drop frames 4 and 5, and it would look like you shot with a 216-degree shutter. But we can do better than that, and there would be no gaps in the motion, because that's the key. But because we have all the information, we can, like to make the 60, for example, instead of just showing every other frame, we can show a frame and maybe part of the frame before it and a little bit of the frame after it superimposed to change the motion blur. And so we have control over it. So it doesn't look like we shot with a 180-degree shutter. If we just dropped every other frame at 60, it would look like we shot it with a 180-degree shutter, but we know that has a strobe-y, uncomfortable look.
Yeah, even at 60.
And so we're able to smooth it out. And so the frames that we can make for 24 and 60 look better than if we shot them at 24 and 60. And we have complete control over how much motion blur is in each shot, or even each portion of each shot.
Yeah, and one thing when we're acquiring that, it's a setting in the camera, but when we're not acquiring it and it's a CG or visual effects created element, that also needs to follow that same rule, right? So everything for CG Junior needed to be rendered with a 360-degree shutter, but also everything that was a digital track, move, sky replacements. It's very important that they are working in 120 and creating it in order for the rest of the pipeline to work. Because if it didn't, then we would have shots where when we blended into 24, that the real background plates would be correct 24, but we would have then juddery, strobe CG elements if this wasn't taken into consideration. So
there's a lot that you have to keep track of, like Derek was just saying. Are they actually doing everything with a 360 shutter, things like that? But from my standpoint, the big complication is that it's visual effects. There's a character who isn't there, and how do you cope with that? And we came up with our ways to cope with it, which are quite different from how we coped with it on Life of Pi, where the tiger wasn't there.
The other X factor in this is the 3D of it all, which is its own complication and challenge for dealing with 3D. But I've never been quite able to pinpoint, where the high frame rate extended to, if that makes sense.
I mean, mostly delivery.
Yeah.
It quadrupled delivery.
Yeah.
I mean, we had 13 DCPs,
Yeah.
but that was not every possible combination of 120 3D 4K. You had 120 3D 2K Dolby Vision. You had 24 2D 2K, everything in between. And we chose 13 versions, and it just made delivery longer. But the ripple effect, the high frame rate, it made the DI was 12 weeks long. And then you had to do the 120 3D 4K version first, and then you went to 24 next. And then you had to do the 60 4K 3D to then make the 60 3D 2K, and it just, the whole chart, it was one affected the other. And when there were,
and we had different brightness levels too, but that was, so definitely the two factors. So the high frame rate means you master in a format that most people can't see, therefore you have to make sub formats, and that's additional deliverables. And then the 3D of it all means you have a 3D version and a 2D version that gets compounded by all of these frame rate versions. And in 3D you also have the issue of distribution being, most theaters out there are too dark in 3D, and is really one of the main reasons why people don't like 3D, is that they were looking at something like 3-foot Lamberts when they're used to seeing 14. So it's about a quarter of the brightness of what they're used to seeing a movie. And so some theaters are brighter and requires a different grade. So for every 3D version that was going into a standard movie theater, we had 2 different brightness levels at both 24 and 60.
Even screening the film, I mean, we had multiple previews, and it's not uncommon to just take your Avid Media, go to a screening room and give them a drive, and they can just hit play, and everyone's confident that it's going to work. Every screening that we had, there were complications. It's not just, oh, we want to screen the film in LA next week. It's like, well, no, that's not. It's got to be like 2 weeks out. And even if we're screening Avid Media, we have to call the theater, find out what their equipment situation is. Do we need to buy our own equipment? Do we need to, and we have to test it. We need to make sure it works. I mean,
they tell us it's going to work, and then when you send the media and it doesn't work.
Right.
And this happened every time. It's just like, no, you have to test it. And we actually canceled one screening at the last minute because they assured us it would work, and it didn't work. And even little things like in Media Composer, there's real-time effects. Well, not at 60. I mean, there are sort of, but nothing you can count on. So we had to render everything all the time. I spent days just sitting there rendering. It's just nothing works the way you're used to.
right, and turnover and rendering for turnover, it all takes longer because it's a higher frame rate. And then it's just bigger files and it's more storage for everybody, for sound and visual effects and the pipeline and all departments.
It's another thing too that we haven't even gotten into is that everything that we've been discussing is picture related, and then once you get into sound, you start talking about it, and it's Pro Tools doesn't support video playback at 60, so they can see that our timeline is 60 and that we're working at 60, but they don't have a 60 frame counter. They can't see 60 frame pictures. So then it just got to a point where that was like, all right, we're just going to have to assume that we're right kind of thing. And we've worked with Pro Tools and they now do support 60 frame playback in the software. But I mean, the ripple effect, it literally affects everything. There wasn't anything we did that was not affected by the high frame rate or the 3D. I mean, just posting a cut for the studio to watch is a much more complicated process. Things that are very, very simple at 2D 24.
Which really comes down to the fact that people don't have the ability to watch it. It's really what it comes down to, right? And including 60, right? Even 60 was a challenge, and we were really, really fortunate, I think, that we had the support of Paramount to push a 60 release. Amazing, the wide release of the 3D version of this in the US was 60 frames per second. And then the 2D release was 24. That was a creative decision ultimately to just focus on those two versions for the domestic.
And the only way to actually see it in theaters in 120 was if you screened it in Dolby Vision. And Dolby released it in, I believe, 13 theaters across America in that format, except in China. They bought the Christie projectors that could screen 120 3D 4K, and they played it in 50 theaters in China, in the Cinity version.
The Cinity format is pretty exciting for on a distribution level because on Billy Lynn there was actually no DCP format. in existence for what we call the full shebang, which is the 120 3D 4K. It just doesn't exist. So the only way to do that playback was off of either a baseline that was set up for that output, or a 7th Sense server could do it. They're another vendor that we work with. And it's limited. But now we do actually have a DCP format that can go directly into these new Christie projectors that I think it goes right into the IMB on the projector. So there's no additional server needed. And that's going to be a bit of a game changer for the format, because you can actually just send a projector somewhere that can do all of it, and we can encrypt DCP and ship it, and it's within that controlled format, which is great.
So it sounds like the technology is catching up to you, like things are adapting. Would you say that's like, and the kind of the thing that we are creating is story, and it's all to serve the story. Do you think it's all starting to gel?
Well, there's two things. I mean, there's multiple things, right? So in terms of the tech, Christie has been a huge support on this. I mean, they had the projectors that could do 120 in the first place, which is where kind of all this started. And they were not cinema projectors at the time. In fact, on Gemini Man, we still didn't have the cinema projectors, which is just, they're brand new. Filmlight has been amazing. They were really just instrumental in us being able to pull off a DI in this way, and dailies and really everything. I mean, it was huge support from them. I know Avid, they've expressed interest in 120. We've sent some test stuff to them, so that's something where in the future maybe we do just cut 120 in Avid.
Hopefully.
Potentially.
Yeah. We've had some issues with there are a lot of stereo adjustments that you have to make, and that you can make cutting in 3D, and right now there's no good way to get that out of Media Composer and into Baselight. We're talking with them about that. We cut sound in 5.1, and we had an issue with Pro Tools where if you keyframed panning, that track would get stuck at that new panning position, and once it came into our sound editors, stuff was coming from the wrong place. They have fixed that, right?
Yeah, no, that's been fixed.
Avid and Pro Tools have been good. It's a little harder for Avid because they're a much bigger company with a big client base, and a very small percentage, I think just us, of that client base is doing 60 3D. So, because there are we've been in the beta program on all the way through both films, and there are problems, things that don't work just for us. They work for everybody else, but they don't work for us. And so obviously those don't go to the top of the fix-it list.
Well, that's why we're kind of here, though, is because this is a very much of a kind of vanguard team and project, and you're pushing the limits of technology in order to evolve the technology. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we do have partners in that. There are people who are interested in pushing that forward. And I mean, the distribution thing is going to just take time, I think. I believe ultimately the theaters are interested in a premium format. I think that's something that is going to continue to be a selling point, to want to have something additional to convince somebody to get out of their house and go to the theaters for that premium thing that you can't get anywhere.
And pay like $18 to see a film, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I'll say too, I mean, back to where we started this and the issues on Life of Pi, I mean, this format makes 3D better. Most of the people that we've showed this to who don't like 3D say after they've seen this format, oh, I like this 3D. And it's a really significant difference in the way that you can experience the environment. It solves pretty much all the issues that we have with 3D projection. Yeah. The brightness level, because that's the other part we haven't talked about actually is, in our premium format, including the Cinity format they rolled out in China with Christie, is brighter. It's a 100 nit target, so it's twice as bright as a normal 2D projector. That makes a huge difference for 3D and clarity. The resolution and the frame rate also they remove the strobiness and the blurriness that makes it hard to fuse an image in 3D, and that inability to fuse something in 3D is what causes eye strain, is what causes there to be discomfort. And whether it's in the format, the projection format, or sometimes it could just be in the quality of the work itself when things are not in the right position in 3D, in the content itself, that can cause eye strain. So we spent a lot of time on this film. And Tim's an amazing editor to work with on that because he cuts in 3D, he does 3D placement. We're still in such early stages of this. There's so much more to try and experiment with.
And everybody on this film had to embrace the 3D, 4K, 120 of it. You know, if you were going to complain about that or grumble about it or fight against it, it just wasn't going to work. Everybody had to be on board right from the beginning that we were doing something that requires a lot more work and is pretty experimental, and there's things we're going to have to figure out. And, you know, everybody had to be on board with that.
And my belief right now is I think acquiring 120 is a really important thing to explore for multiple reasons. From, you know, projecting on 120 for doing synthetic shutters where you can make 24 or 60 for ramping speed effects that you couldn't do unless you did it in camera. I mean, there's a whole number of reasons to acquire that, and I think that the only thing that's really going to bring that to the filmmakers as a tool that they can use creatively is if the vendors see the interest in pushing it and can get on board with supporting it, really. And we're not going to know. I mean, it's the chicken and the egg thing constantly. You know, we're not going to have a huge forum for high frame rate if you don't have a lot of content, but you're not going to get a lot of content made unless there's a forum for it. So, and that's to Eng's credit ultimately for being so brave to push. And I mean, he's the biggest champion for all of this, really. I mean, it's a passion for him. He really believes in it. And he's just really, it's such a courageous filmmaker, I can't even say.
To have a director who is so willing to take risks and will put so much faith in the technology and in all of us to make the technology work. It's really amazing that he does that he is so fearless about just jumping in.
He feels this is the way we should all watch movies. It's a much more immersive experience, and there's so many ways to watch content now. It's a reason, really, to go to see something on the big screen.
Yeah, and I guarantee, I mean, if anybody has the opportunity, and you've never, it's not video. It's not like going to see soap opera and we're just making stuff up. It's a completely different experience. Yeah. It really, you won't know until you go and see it. That's all I can say.
Yeah, and when you go see it, keep in mind young Will Smith is pure CG.
Yes.
Face, body, everything, completely CG. Because, I mean, that was the other really rewarding part of the film is working with Weta. And the just astounding work they did in directing a character who wasn't there, you know, that we used his performance capture, but we were also able to tweak it where we needed to or where we wanted to. And, you know, to be able to cut his performance together, and I could, within one shot, use different takes and have them stitch them together to make it look seamless. But the emotional content of that performance is astounding. When you realize it's CG, and it's as good as when he did the performance capture.
Definitely just give a shout out also to Bill Westenhofer, who's incredible, the VFX supervisor.
VFX supervisor, who also did Life of Pi with us.
From a technical and creative standpoint, I mean, as far as like an assistant editor is concerned, I mean, you know, you really use a lot more of your brain. You really, because you got to think outside the box for everything that you're doing. I think there is a world where high frame rate 3D should exist and will exist, and I hope that people can embrace it and can attempt to use it in the best way possible. Especially, I think, like, the big thing is if there are any young filmmakers out there who want to, like, experiment with this and find ways to utilize high frame rate, I think that would be really special, and that would be smart, because those are the people who are going to be making movies in the future.
We definitely, I want to say that it was a running mantra in my head, too, for a while, that we were doing progress over stability when dealing with bugs and software bugs. And it was just the reality of it. But we were definitely in that mindset.
We really had a hard time many times throughout the project for various challenges, and how it ended up, you know, seeing the first screening with the bobbleheads and seeing this beautiful final film that you really feel a part of, and being able to screen it in 120 or even 60 is really amazing. And I'm just proud of the team because it came together in the end.
On a simplest level, I'd encourage people, if they're doing tests, just to play around a little bit with 60, and I think that if you wanted to play around with 120, even in 2D, because the 3D was another big part of it, but in 2D, I did some tests myself just on a weekend, I don't know, a year ago, just on a red camera, and it wasn't a perfect shutter and whatever, but I use the True Motion software, which is what we use to do all of our frame blending, and it's really fun and it's cool, and you can try different shutters, and you can learn, if nothing else. Even for any film teachers out there, get your hands on that software to talk about frame rate and shutter angle and motion blur, because there's no better way to really grasp it than to have the frames to look at. Shoot something at 120, look at the frame, see motion, shoot a fan, whatever. Blend it down to different frame rates and see what it feels like. It's really fascinating. It's hard to project and see 120, but 60 is easy. Every TV does 60, every projector does 60. So
your iPhone records at 60.
Your iPhone records at 60. Yeah, there you go. And storytelling wise, I think, the high frame rate, I just don't believe that we're going to stop.
We welcome your comments or suggestions. Write us at framebyframe@postnewyork.org. And if you like this episode and know someone else who might, share it with friends or catch up on previous episodes. As always, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. It's worth mentioning that when I walked in to begin our conversation about GEMINI Man, picture editor Tim Squyres, assistant editor Andrew Leven, and apprentice editor Tim Quain were all hard at work on the next project. The apprentice position is an important part of seeding the next generation of New York professionals, and there are a lot of good people with intelligence, sincerity, and enthusiasm for the craft of any background, gender, and age. You can hire an apprentice or learn more about how to become one through the Made in New York Media Post-Production Training Program. Stay tuned for the next episode of Frame by Frame with a team from Apollo 11. From New York, I'm Isabel Siderney, and this is Frame by Frame.